My name is Kevin Barni, and just a little context, a previous life before coming back to Chad, I was in charge of the Delaware Historical Marker Program. So this is sort of where this was born from, and it has since evolved since my time there and reevaluating it as an outsider now. So historical markers represent early efforts to highlight roadside places, encouraging motorists to explore roadways while learning about local and regional history. However, the sites selected and stories told, or more importantly, those left untold, underscore that these early programs were not always as altruistic as perceived. This paper explores three interconnected themes related to the state of Delaware's historical marker program. First, examining its early history in the context of the colonial revival and Americanization movements. Relatedly, arguing for an approach for preserving legacy markers as artifacts of the eras in which they were created. Finally, I take a detour by discussing the implications of preserving, without context, the highly curated early Delaware marker landscape, questioning if the assemblage, with roots in populist ideals of the time, might be seen as a new opportunity to reflect upon how and why we commemorate, a worthy endeavor in today's political climate. The establishment of the Delaware Marker Program is situated firmly in the colonial revival movement. In the original catalog of markers compiled by the Delaware Historic Marker Commission in 1929, focused heavily on Delaware's revolutionary and colonial history. Historians attribute the beginning of colonial revivalism to the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876, intended to highlight modern technology while also celebrating the 100th anniversary of American independence. The Centennial Exhibition fueled interest in America's golden age, ushering in an era of fascination with the nation's past. The movement, however, was not only about commemorating the nation's history. It was about legitimizing places and communities through ties to the past. The newly awakened interest in the colonial era arose during a time of great and unsettling change in the nation. During the last quarter of the 19th century, economic production shifted away from agriculture to industry, and the Industrial Revolution sparked the need for more wage laborers. To fill the demand, an influx of Chinese and European immigrants arrived in great waves. R.T.H. Halsey, a leading proponent of the colonial revival movement, wrote anxiously, "The tremendous changes in the character of our nation and the influx of foreign ideas, utterly at variance with those held by the men who gave us the Republic, threaten, and unless checked, may shake the foundation of our Republic." The promoters of the colonial revival movement hoped to regain and retain what they felt was the real America by promoting art and architectural styles from our nation's past, and by preserving sites and patriotic stories associated with America's early history. The colonial revival movement reached its zenith in the 1920s, and during this time, genealogical and historical societies also increased significantly in number, linking their families, communities, and towns to revolutionary heroes and a romanticized colonial past, a movement now known as associationism. It's within this climate that the first historical marker programs appear, with the state of Virginia leading the charge. The Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, founded in 1889, erected the first statewide historical markers in the country. Their goal, reflective of the morals and ideals of the colonial revival movement, promoted and encouraged traditionalist views of Virginia history, celebrating the colonial past while promoting the traditions of associationism. The Delaware Marker Program was also a product, even if indirectly, of the related Americanization movement, which sought to show immigrants, quote, "the spirit of America, the knowledge of America, and the love of America," end quote. In 1918, a group of 80 prominent Delawareans, under the leadership of Pierre S. DuPont, formed the Service Citizens of Delaware. The group primarily focused on housing and school reform, instituting programs that were often targeted to serve the African American community. They also offered Americanization classes during the 1920s, teaching Eastern and Southern European immigrants quote, English and the knowledge of their adopted nation, end quote. Historian Paul Cuviolis states that, quote, Delaware's Americanization class was a soft assimilation program, end quote. But its existence clearly reveals prevalent anxieties surrounding growing foreign-born populations, anxieties that sparked and propelled the colonial revival movement, Americanization programs, and commemorative efforts like historical marker programs. In a small state like Delaware, the same networks of wealthy philanthropists and reformers were behind many of these patriotic statewide initiatives. The Delaware Historical Marker Commission formed in 1929 after several patriotic societies and citizens petitioned Governor C. Douglas Buck for a statewide program designed to commemorate and recognize Delaware's history. Buck's familiar relationships and social connections certainly influenced his civic-minded marker program, as he married into the DuPont family in 1921 when he wed Alice DuPont. His new father-in-law, T. Coleman DuPont, was personally responsible for the construction of the first highway to span the entire length of the state, and gave Buck the job as chief engineer of the project from 1921 until he was elected governor in 1927. The DuPont Highway, created as a public road, constructed and paid for personally by T. Coleman DuPont, was gifted and dedicated to the citizens of Delaware on July 2nd, 1924. It's not surprising that one of Buck's first gubernatorial commissions centered on the creation of a historic marker program, which placed an overwhelming majority of its markers along the newly created DuPont Highway. Buck appointed 7 affluential Delawareans to connect a statewide survey of historic places and notable events worthy of commemoration. His commission made quick work of their tasks. At their second meeting in December of 1930, a year after their founding, the commission had established their list of locations and topics for historical markers. The commission's selection, unsurprisingly, highly favored sites that linked places in Delaware to colonial history. Similar to the early days of the historic preservation movement, the Delaware Marker Commission chose to focus the program on heroes of the Revolutionary War. Newcastle County, the northernmost and most densely settled county in Delaware, contained the most markers and had a clear brand to the stories they established. Remarkably, over 1/3 of the initial markers, 20 out of 59, mentioned George Washington, an obvious attempt to legitimize Delaware's colonial past, while reminding roadside readers of the Anglo-American origins of the nation. Throughout the state, the marker landscape presented a narrow scope of content and excluded pieces of history that did not fit within a strict ideal narrative of the American past. In fact, only 3 sites selected were significant to Native American history. Of note is the fact that these narratives only discussed Native Americans in relation to white history, while no sites were dedicated to women or African Americans. In his work, The Social Construction of Historical Significance, preservationist Howard L. Green summarizes this issue neatly by stating, "Until comparatively recently, important was defined in a narrow social and political term. It was uncontroversial. Everyone knew what was important: the homes and other buildings associated with political, military, and business leaders, those who today are sometimes derided as dead white men. Historic usually means important to history or well-known. Historical means associated with things of the past. Simply put, even our label, historic preservation, betrays our elitist origins." The Delaware Marker Commission tapped into the sentiment of the time, and the prevailing understanding of historical significance used by the committee is the same one described by Green. This intentional lack of diversity allowed the Marker Commission to create what could be considered a false historical narrative and context, which they pushed onto motorists by the way of a small guidebook. As preservationists John Jackal and Keith Schell have pointed out, quote, "Celebrating the past can produce not a historical awareness so much as a false sense of what might be called heritage," end quote. Heritage speaks not to the past as it was so much, but to a past as people might wish it to have been. Typically, such assertions assign contemporary social or cultural agendas in the name of an imagined past. To this point, many of the early groups producing markers were proponents of the lost cause of the Confederacy, which promoted a history significant to them. As L.P. Hartley wrote during another turbulent era, quote, "Heritage activists use the past to find roots, to affirm identities, claim legacies, to celebrate collective bonds, and to introduce rivals." End quote. Colonial Revival era historical programs like the Historic Marker Commission had mostly noble intention. These commemorative efforts were a reaction to turbulent times in our nation, and American leaders sought to conjure the nation's early traditions as a stabilizing cultural force, while also aligning with the past as a way to separate themselves from newly arrived immigrants. However, this need for differentiation and desire to neutralize cultural otherness led to a carefully curated historical landscape, adhering closely to the newly created DuPont Highway, and a collection of historic markers that highlighted one heritage and one dimension of history, to the exclusion of many others. Delaware's early historical markers are physical and intellectual artifacts of the early 20th century. As an assemblage, they represent a landscape of selected heritage designed by a wealthy class as a way to impose American ideals on the shifting and increasingly placeless national roadside. They sought to legitimize the history of the state through association to what was considered the golden age of the nation. This legitimization, located just off the roadway, ensured that by word of mouth or a guidebook would help foster stronger state and national identities. So how might we evaluate, interpret, and conserve these culturally charged objects almost 100 years later? First, consider that the original cast iron historical markers are now themselves historically significant, both through being over 50 years old and for embodying a national historic trend at a statewide level. Furthermore, early historical markers are among the last vestiges of the earliest roadside architecture that dominated the landscape in the early to mid-20th century in Delaware. So their conservation and curation is an important historic preservation question, and one that becomes more pressing with time. Historical markers have a host of condition issues based on inherent vice of materials used in fabrication. It's unreal to expect that a marker will remain pristine in perpetuity while outside. Metal, the primary component of all markers, quickly erodes in the presence of water. And given that there's often no shelter for these objects, little can be done to slow the effects of weathering. Additionally, markers face mechanical threats. Cars and snowplows are often the cause of their untimely demise. To date, 136, or 20% of total historical markers are considered missing. An additional 202, or 30%, have a condition issue requiring repair or restoration. Estimates as of December 2017 show it would cost the state between $325,000 to $500,000 to adequately address all of the necessary repairs to the existing catalog of markers. The remaining cast iron markers present an additional challenge, as current practice requires sandblasting to remove rust and to provide a clean surface for new paint. With each restoration, more material is lost, and this begins to wear away lettering. The more times a marker is refurbished, the harder it becomes to read. The original cast iron markers in Delaware, 101, or 66%, are now considered missing by the State Archive. This vast amount of loss makes preserving the remaining markers all the more worthwhile, as they are the actual end product of the Marker Commission and a snapshot of early 20th century commemorative efforts. With this in mind, the Historical Marker Coordinator has to reconcile the preservation of historical artifacts and material with the advancing scholarship of the topics discussed on the markers. Herein lies the issue. The early marker text reflects the era in which it was written, while continuing to stand as the official interpretation of a site or event by the state program for modern-day readers. The Marker Coordinator is currently considering whether to replace the missing markers as they were originally created, or to update the text to reflect current scholarship. Reproduction markers, if chosen, would contain the same text, but would not be the same materials or display the same finish of those initially installed. This has long been a concern from a preservation perspective. The marker program shuttered during World War II due to lack of iron available for production. By 1945, At the close of the war, citizens were upset that 16 markers were missing, and the state archivist, Leon de Vallinger, set out to replace them. Upon reaching out to the foundry, de Vallinger was dismayed to hear that the markers molds had been sold, and in the process were melted down. Any marker produced post-1933 is made from a non-original mold and is currently made with entirely different materials. The result, then, is modern science with old narratives. When an original marker needs to be replaced, it provides a valuable opportunity to update the interpretive text to provide better scholarship. For example, a Delaware marker replaced in 2017 near an area called Coin Beach for the shipwreck of the Faithful Steward was updated to reflect new information learned over the past 80 years about the shipwreck. The original text read, "Bound from Londonderry, Ireland to Philadelphia with 249 immigrants, the Faithful Steward ran aground on a shoal where she was destroyed by stormy seas with a heavy loss of life." The revised text reads, "The Faithful Steward, bound from Londonderry, Ireland to Philadelphia, ran aground on a shoal September 1st, 1785, with 249 passengers aboard. Stormy weather drove the vessel towards the shore where it became stranded in 4 fathoms, 24 feet of water, within 100 yards of the shoreline. Strong winds capsized the ship, and 181 passengers, including 93 women and children, perished. Looters soon arrived, carried off trunks of personal cargo, and picked the pockets of the deceased. The ship carried 400 barrels of British copper halfpennies and rose gold guineas. The coins redeposit along the shore after strong storms, giving rise to the name Coin Beach." This is the only marker from the original set that features updated text. This rewriting retains the historic intention of the marker, while providing today's readers with better historical information. With faithful reproduction of historical signs now impossible, why stymie ourselves with outdated text? Recently, markers and monuments have shifted from solely uncontroversial mainstream narratives to include uncomfortable histories and stories of underrepresented groups. Additionally, as our collective conscience reflects on our history, we evolve our understanding of what should or should not be commemorated. In the wake of the Charleston church shooting in June 2015, several municipalities in the United States removed monuments and memorials on public property dedicated to the Confederate States of America. The momentum accelerated in August 2017 after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. The removals were driven by the belief that the monuments glorify white supremacy and memorialize a government whose founding principle was the perpetuation and expansion of slavery. Many of those who object to the removal claim that the artifacts are part of the cultural heritage of the United States. The vast majority of these Confederate monuments were built during the era of Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement as a means of intimidating African Americans and reaffirming white supremacy. The monuments have thus become highly politicized. According to Eleanor Harvey, a senior curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and a scholar of Civil War history, quote, "If white nationalists and neo-Nazis are now claiming this as part of their heritage, they've essentially co-opted these images and those statues beyond any capacity to neutralize them again," end quote. However, I pose that by commemorating an event, individuals and groups make it impossible for these sites to remain neutral. And this is the landscape that all historical markers inhabit. In keeping our historic markers and their text faithful to the early 20th century ideas, knowledge, and language, new motorists confront these sites without an understanding of early context of these markers. Often, people break for historic markers, but they are dismissed as relics of an earlier time. And the opportunity is lost to interpret the historical formation of the markers and the curated message that they created. One solution to this problem might be to create a new guidebook to the historical markers, like the one that was created in 1933, except with an analysis of each marker and its site, which incorporates modern scholarship and interpretations. The book, available online, would offer a more immersive experience and be more educational than the static messages currently on display. In closing, I leave you with this. In early 2016, the Marker program began work on a marker to commemorate a racially motivated bombing in a Wilmington suburb during the late 1950s. While the information presented is unbiased, it still churned up long-buried feelings, tying back to my earlier point that there is no neutrality in commemoration. The local paper ran an article on the marker